Okay, I think we're all set to start. I want to first introduce myself. My name is Vicki Rovine. I'm the director of Carolina Public Humanities, or as we call it, CPH. And I'm also a professor in the Department of Art and Art History. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's Humanities in Action event. I want to welcome everyone who's here in the room and also the folks on Zoom who are joining us there. We look forward to hearing from our speaker, and importantly, we also look forward to hearing from all of you in our Q&A period after. So today's presentation has a very intriguing title, Trust Me, Not Them, A Critical Look. And presenting today will be Will Connor, who is a brand new to UNC teaching assistant professor of philosophy in the Philosophy, Politics, and Economics program, also known as PPE, because we love acronyms here. He's also a postdoc in the Applied Epistemology Project. And I just want to add that Will has very successfully explained to me what applied epistemology means. And that is exactly the framework that you're going to use today. So this event is presented in partnership with UNC's PPE, Philosophy, Politics, and Economics program. So thanks to the Department of Philosophy. Many thanks as well to Carolina alumni for their support and to our many, many individual donors who support all of our programming through their donations. I also want to thank Flyleaf for their ongoing partnerships with us as well. Many of you come to many of these events, and you know how congenial it is here to gather at Flyleaf. I also want to mention that this is just one of the philosophy programs we're presenting this week. Some of you may be aware that this Friday and Saturday, we're convening the E. Maynard Adams Symposium in the Humanities, which is CPH's really flagship event every year. Our keynote speaker, who is a very esteemed professor of philosophy and humanities and comparative literature, emeritus at Princeton University, Alexander Nehemas, will be speaking as the keynoter on Friday at 5:30 at the Friday Center. And we have flyers in the back about that. And we were just talking about that, and Will, I can attest that a philosopher is well familiar with Nehemas's work. So anybody who's interested in these topics, I think will find much in the symposium as well. The presentation we're going to hear tonight is very timely, but perhaps it has always been timely. We're going to think about how to evaluate when to trust someone, especially someone who is trying to predispose us not to believe the evidence we're seeing or hearing, and to doubt the sources we might otherwise believe. I look forward to learning about this very tricky and very consequential philosophical problem. I'm counting on leaving here with the key to interpreting sources that barrage us with information and misinformation. So I'm counting on that. Will is going to speak for about 50 minutes or so, and then we'll follow that with questions. So I'd like to invite Will to come on up and present.
Righty. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I'm excited to talk with you all. So I think we'll probably all be a little bit familiar with the kinds of situations I'm going to talk about today, but we might not have thought through how to respond to them. So that's going to be our main topic for today. So I want to start with something that will probably sound pretty familiar. So imagine, you're on social media or the internet, kind of scrolling around as one does, and you encounter a post from a politician. And this politician says something like, the media is going to attack me, but you can't trust them. They're not reliable. They're going to release this report that says, some policy that I've implemented is inappropriate or will actually be harmful, but they're biased. So you can set aside their testimony, their report that they're going to give you. You don't have to take it seriously. You should trust me, not them. Okay, so we probably all hear this kind of thing fairly often. On the way here, I was listening to the radio actually, and I heard this on the way here, which was interesting. So there was a report from the IRS that apparently tax scams are going around right now. It's tax season, so the IRS is warning people, if you get a text that asks you for your private information, don't trust the sender. The IRS will never ask you for your private information over a text. And I think that's nice because it illustrates that sometimes what I'm going to call preemptive warnings these warnings that aim to get us not to believe a piece of evidence before we've encountered it can actually sometimes be good. They can be helpful for us. They can serve a legitimate purpose, but sometimes they can be bad. Sometimes they can serve to manipulate us. So the question we're going to be focusing on is how we should respond to these preemptive warnings. Okay. So that's our topic. Before we get started, I'm actually curious. I want to have a little bit of audience participation so everyone, stays active. So I'm curious if you have a favorite example of a preemptive warning. Have you ever encountered one of these? Are you familiar with this? Anyone want to share? Yeah, John. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Asking for money or, oh my God, they're gonna do something that.
Yeah. Sometimes you get requests for money. I think sometimes people might warn you not to heed those kinds of requests, right? Yeah, that's the kind of preemptive warning I'm looking for. Yeah. Any other examples? Sure. Yeah.
Asking and calling from a call from a bank and saying that
Mhm.
your account has been compromised.
Yeah.
You need to give us your PIN number
Mhm.
and so we can fix things for you.
Yeah.
And then they do.
Yep. Yeah. That's right. Yeah. Any others? Mhm. Yeah.
Your discharge has been put on your account and there was no charge. I mean,
Yeah.
that was-
Okay. Yeah. So sometimes we do get texts that seem like scams. Sometimes they might be legitimate though. So we need to know how to respond to them. Yeah.
So there's just been examples where the Secretary of Defense said, you're going to hear that I was betraying secret information, but this is a journalist who can never be trusted and he's awful.
Yeah. Yep.
Is that
That's
just
a
a
good example.
hypothetical?
Yeah, not hypothetical at all. Yeah. Great. Yeah. So we're all familiar with these. And I think there are a few reasons why we need to think carefully about these kinds of preemptive warnings that aim to get us not to trust a source or a piece of evidence before we've ever even encountered it. And like I said, sometimes these warnings can be helpful, but we face some problems here. So the reason why I think we tend to sometimes issue these warnings to other people and why they issue them to us is that we live in a complex informational environment. So we're all familiar with this by this point. We have social media constantly blasting content at our eyeballs. We have the internet and traditional media, television. We have our friends and our peers, our coworkers, all providing us with information all the time. Often this information is contradictory. We have to figure out how to balance and weigh all these competing pieces of information. And we have limited time and limited cognitive sort of resources to draw on, limited attention. We want to believe a whole lot of things. We want to have beliefs about politics, science, maybe history, things that interest us, but we don't have time to develop expertise in all these things. So given, the fact that we want to have beliefs in across a wide range of domains, and the fact that we live in such complex environments where there's all sorts of information, a lot of which is contradictory, we have to trust people. That's our only way to kind of navigate through the informational landscape. We can't do it all on our own. But with trust comes the possibility of being manipulated. So the more you trust someone, the more, in some sense, you're kind of under their power. So when we entrust ourselves to another, we trust that they're going to treat us well and responsibly. But they might not. They might take advantage of us. So with trust comes manipulability. Okay. And this is why it's very important to think carefully about preemptive warnings. They can sometimes be genuinely beneficial and help us not fall prey to scams or help us not believe misinformation, but they can be used to manipulate us in a way that I'll talk about as well. So they have this dual nature. They can help us kind of cut through the confusion and haze that comes about in our complex informational environment, but with the risk of possibly being manipulated in ways that we don't realize. Okay, so given this, our guiding questions are twofold. We are first going to ask, should we ever believe preemptive warnings? And if so, when? When is it justified or rational for us to believe those warnings? And then we'll also ask the question, can we ever tell the difference between harmful and beneficial preemptive warnings? And if so, how? How can we build up that skill to kind of protect ourselves and trust responsibly and appropriately in our complex informational environment? Okay. So I'm approaching this issue from the perspective of an epistemologist. That's an area of philosophy that focuses on questions related to knowledge and belief and rationality. So we try to figure out what it is to know something, the conditions under which you know it. We think about when a belief is rational or irrational. We think about what it is for a belief to be based on your evidence. And applied epistemology, my specialty, tries to take those very theoretical questions and actually see what answers we can give to them in relation to everyday problems we find ourselves facing, like preemptive warnings. So that's the perspective that I'm going to be taking on this issue. And these questions are what a philosopher would call normative questions. They aim to tell us something that we should or shouldn't do, a way that it would be good for us to reason or bad for us to reason. So they have some sort of evaluation or evaluative component built in. But there's a different kind of question we can ask, and those are called descriptive questions. Those are questions that just ask how a bit of the world works. So we're going to actually start by investigating a descriptive set of descriptive questions. How do preemptive warnings work? What is their nature, and why are they so compelling? After that, after we get a better understanding of the nature of these warnings, we'll then turn to our normative questions and hopefully arrive at sound answers we can apply as we go forward. Okay, so that's our plan. All righty. So it's helpful to distinguish two kinds of preemptive warnings. They work a little bit differently. So on the one hand, we could talk about what I've called content neutralization. So this is a preemptive warning that often sounds like, well, you know, that person, say a politician or a scientist or a media outlet, they're going to say X, some claim X, but actually X is false. When they say X, you don't have to regard that seriously. I've already kind of baked that into my beliefs, and I think that I can remain highly confident that what I've said is true, even though those people say otherwise. So you don't have to take it seriously. The idea here is that this tries to convince you that the person sharing this claim with you, doing this content neutralization, already has a rational belief, and it's rational even though other people disagree. Okay. So it tries to basically say you're going to receive some evidence in the future that just doesn't have a whole lot of force. You don't need to take it very seriously. The second form actually tries to discredit a source more directly. It might not target a particular claim, but it will target kind of the nature or quality of the source. So someone will say, you can't trust that particular person because they are biased. They have a history of false reports, or they have some incentive to be saying one thing rather than another that doesn't align with the truth. Okay. So it's helpful for us to know that these preemptive warnings can come in these two different forms. And we see this kind of all over the place in our society. We see preemptive warnings show up in politics, in business, in medicine, even in personal relationships. Sometimes people might try to manipulate you by offering you a preemptive warning. When they're your friend, they're trying to get you to believe a certain thing. Or they might actually be giving you a preemptive warning that aims to help you. They want to, say, prevent you from falling prey to a dishonest car salesman, we could say, might say, oh, they say they won't charge you, exorbitant interest down there at, the used auto lot, but actually you should be pretty careful. Okay. So these warnings show up in various places. One thing that I've thought a lot about in my work is conspiracy theories too. So these warnings often show up in conspiracy theories, especially. People will say things like, well, of course, the mainstream media, they don't want you to actually know the truth about this. So, they're going to say all our beliefs are false. But the reason they're doing that is just to plant misleading evidence to kind of throw us off the case. Okay. So these warnings are very common. And it's helpful in philosophy to consider kind of case studies to see where the rubber meets the road in a kind of worked out example that's fairly realistic. So I want to introduce you to a character called Sarah. Okay. And Sarah uses social media quite a bit, and she follows health influencers. So people who make all sorts of claims about medicine on social media. And many of them don't have medical expertise. Many of them don't have specialized training or knowledge. Okay. But nonetheless, they promote a variety of supplements. And Sarah takes one of them. She's told that she should take supplement X because supplement X is going to cure anxiety. It's going to strengthen her immunities for sure. And the medical establishment, they don't want you to know that because if you started taking supplement X, you wouldn't need the medications that they're paid to prescribe by Big Pharma. So Sarah hears these kinds of preemptive warnings that tell her if information comes out that says supplement X is not safe or it's not effective, you can set those aside. Probably the researchers who conducted those studies are biased. We don't know where they were getting their funding from. Their research methods might be flawed. They might be ignoring relevant evidence. They certainly don't take our personal experience, our own knowledge of the success of supplement X into account. These influencers might also say that scientists are prone to peer pressure and conformity, just like the rest of us. So they might not actually be permitted to publish papers that are critical of the medical establishment. So really, you just can't put a whole lot of stock in the information coming from the health establishment. Okay. So Sarah is getting kind of blasted with all this content when she's on social media, and she believes it. She accepts these preemptive warnings. So going forward, when she sees a news report that says, actually, it's come out that supplement X is dangerous, or supplement X doesn't do what it was alleged to do, Sarah believes or doesn't believe those stories, and she keeps on taking supplement X, maybe to her own detriment. Okay, so it seems like Sarah has done something wrong. And I think this demonstrates how preemptive testimony or preemptive warnings can create a kind of comprehensive interpretive framework that actually comes like in this pre-baked sort of way. Sarah can just accept this entire worldview and way of thinking and apply that to any evidence you present to her and be able to sort of, by her own lights, at least from her internal perspective, retain confidence in her beliefs. And it becomes very difficult when someone's in that kind of framework to actually convince them of the truth. So here we're stipulating that Sarah's wrong. That might not be the case. Maybe sometimes you come to believe a preemptive warning that's correct, but in this case, Sarah is wrong. Okay. And it's very tough to see how to get Sarah out of this kind of situation, in part because all the evidence we might give her, it's not just that it's preempted, it's that it works kind of in the opposite way. It doesn't work in the way evidence should. When we give Sarah a study that says, actually, this supplement is dangerous or ineffective, Sarah will take it not as evidence for those claims. She'll take this as evidence of a cover-up. So the more countervailing evidence you give Sarah, the more confident she is that her beliefs are true. And there seems to be no way, so to speak, to rescue Sarah. Okay. So what makes these warnings so effective is that they don't just neutralize the force of evidence or make evidence weaker than it would be. They invert its power at the same time. Okay. So I think it's helpful to think about why these warnings are so effective. We now have an understanding of how they work. They can kind of weaken the force of evidence. They can even invert its strength and lead evidence to do the wrong thing. But why do we fall prey to them? What's going on here on kind of a psychological level? Well, there are a few reasons why preemptive warnings are so powerful. And I'm going to give you two sets of reasons. One has to do with the way that we tend to reason. We like offloading cognitive effort when possible. The second set of reasons, which I'll get to in a minute, concerns our social identities. Okay, we like to preserve those. And sometimes that can affect how we reason and how we form our beliefs. But let's talk about cognitive load first. So sometimes our evidence is unclear. I've been in situations before where I read a news story and I don't quite know what to make of it. I think like, maybe I should be a little bit less confident about something I believed before. But then this other outlet that tends to be pretty reliable says something else. And then, my friends and family, they're all kind of divided on this. What do I do with this? So if you find yourself in a situation where you're unsure of what the evidence you have supports, preemptive testimony can kind of cut through the haze. It can resolve this uncertainty. If you come at kind of a body of evidence with this preconception of how reliable the sources are or how likely it is to be correct, that can allow you to reduce the uncertainty that you feel in response to that evidence. And our brains love that. Our brains love avoiding hard cognitive work. So we are very tempted to go in for preemptive warnings when possible in order to avoid the laborious task of actually thinking, which we turn out not to really like doing, that seems. Okay. So another reason why preemptive warnings tend to be so powerful is that we have a tendency basically to reason and process evidence in ways that allow us to retain the beliefs we already have. So this is called generally confirmation bias among philosophers and psychologists. So we like to interpret evidence in ways that support what we already think and explain away evidence that counts against what we already believe. Okay. And preemptive testimony, preemptive warnings can help with this. They can make it easier for us to explain away a piece of inconvenient evidence. We can say, oh, it came from a source that's not very reliable, so I don't need to change my views. I can just ignore that. Okay. So our brains love preemptive testimony for these reasons. Okay. So before we move on, I'm kind of curious, just as a matter of sociology almost. I like getting the opinion of different groups to see what your own lived experience is like. Have you found yourselves in a situation where you're unsure of what your evidence supports? And if so, how did you navigate that? Yeah, Elliot.
I think that one thing that I've tried to get into the habit with as I've gotten started learning more about, well, in your class, like epistemology and stuff,
Yeah.
but just in general, is like I've started to suspend my judgment a lot more
Mhm.
in terms of when there's like an issue that someone brings up to me and I don't quite think that I have a full on grasp about everything. And I don't maybe a lot of times because I don't have time to do the cognitive workload of like,
Mhm.
I'm in a discussion with them right now. So I'm not going to pull up my laptop and research all the details and stuff in a bunch of different studies and read them all. So I typically have like fallen into the habit of like suspending my judgment a lot of the times on these issues.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting take, that sometimes maybe what we should do in the heat of the moment, so to speak, is suspend our judgment. Maybe don't take a firm stance on the issue, step back. I think that's an interesting and responsible take. Yeah. Anyone else? How do you navigate this kind of uncertainty? Yeah.
Also think or suspect that preemptive warnings play into our need for feeling superior, feeling like we know a little bit more than other people
Yeah.
and that we're ahead of the game.
That's right. They can be rewarding in that way. It feels like we have some secret knowledge. We're kind of in on it in a way that other people aren't. So we can kind of rest on our laurels in a way that I think we often take some pride in and pleasure in. Yeah. All right. So that is one set of reasons why preemptive warnings are so powerful. They help us offload cognitive effort in a way that we like doing. The second reason is to basically promote social harmony and group cohesion. So here we see all these brains smiling in unison. They're all in agreement, and we love agreeing with our peers. Preemptive testimony can help us do that. So our beliefs partially shape and constitute our identities. So our political beliefs form an important core of who we are and who we take ourselves to be, the kinds of things we take to be important. Our moral beliefs do the same thing, our religious beliefs. Increasingly, many people's beliefs seem to have these kind of identity constituting features. Okay, so even beliefs about things that it seems like maybe shouldn't have those kinds of features. So something like being skeptical about the safety of vaccines has come to be kind of a part of people's identity in an interesting way. And while there can be good reasons for that, and this is not always a bad thing, it comes with danger. Because if you believe something that's kind of uncommon for your peer group, you can face social pressure not to. You can face disapproval. You can be kind of kicked out of the group, ostracized. And we want to avoid that. We work very hard to remain in cohesion with our groups. Okay, so preemptive warnings can kind of set the standards for group membership in a way they can basically say, in this group, we trust these people. If you violate that, then all of a sudden, you're out of the group or you're at risk of being kicked out of the group. Okay. So believing a preemptive warning can actually help promote and sustain social cohesion. And that's not always a bad thing, but it's risky. Okay. So those are the two sets of reasons why preemptive warnings are so powerful. Offloading cognitive effort and promoting and maintaining social cohesion. Okay. So those are some descriptive questions. Questions that aim to tell us a little bit about how preemptive warnings work and their nature. But we're now ready to get to the meat of the matter, the normative questions. What should we do with preemptive warnings? Okay. How should we respond to them? And I want to start by thinking a little bit more about what I'm going to call justified preemption. Preemption gone right. Cases where it seems like we should believe a preemptive warning. Okay. Because it's helpful to know that not all of these warnings are bad. By thinking about the good cases, we can get clear on the bad cases. Okay. So we can imagine a few different scenarios we might find ourselves in, or that one might find oneself in. You can think of a child who's being warned by a parent not to trust strangers online. You can think of a doctor advising a patient, don't trust althealthnews.com. I checked, that's not actually a real website. I was kind of surprised. I thought it might be, but it's not. But a doctor might say something like that. They might say, if you trust this website, you're likely not to, take a medication that actually would be beneficial for you. Okay. We can also think about science educators warning students about believing misinformation. We could think about the IRS telling you not to believe when someone texts you that they, need your tax information to file your return or something. Okay. So there are all sorts of good cases of preemption. And in each case, the preemption serves a legitimate function. It serves to really protect us from a bit of manipulation that we might otherwise have fallen prey to. And it seems reasonable to believe that. Presumably, a child should believe their parent when they say not to trust a particular person. And presumably I, non-expert with respect to medicine, should trust my doctor if she says not to, go to althealthnews.com. Okay. But what is it that makes it reasonable to believe preemptive warnings in those situations? I think we can isolate a few factors at play, and then that helps us more easily and helpfully contrast the good cases and the bad. Okay. So we can kind of follow a little checklist I've come up here. When we receive a preemptive warning, one thing we can look at is whether the speaker is actually an expert. And in each of these cases, it seems like the person issuing the warning is a kind of expert. Now, maybe your parents, they're not always right about who you should trust, but they're probably right that you shouldn't trust strangers online. They've got way more experience than a child does. So they seem like kind of an expert about that. Doctors, clearly medical experts. A consumer protection agency that says not to trust some scam that's going around. They seem like experts on those matters. So we can look into that. Okay. And that's one positive feature about these cases. Second, I think this is interesting and often goes missing in how we reason through these situations. We can think about specificity. So we need to think about how specific and precise the claims are. The doctor doesn't say, don't trust anyone but me. Anyone who says otherwise is trying to pull one over on you. She says, don't go to this particular website. The Consumer Protection Agency says, don't trust this particular scam going around from this particular source. They don't say, don't trust anyone but us ever. Okay, so they're giving us specific warnings that target particular claims and sources. Okay. And third, we can look at the reasons or argument that a speaker can give. And in the best case, someone issuing a preemptive warning that actually has our best interest in mind will also give us an argument. They won't just say, don't trust another source. They'll say, don't trust another source because, and then they'll present evidence that we can actually assess. And they might encourage us to critically or think critically about that evidence. They're not just hoping that we take their warning on faith. They're explaining it in a way that actually makes sense to us, that we can really reason with. So these warnings that we talked about, I would posit it's rational to believe them because they have all these nice features, what a philosopher might call a good-making feature, 4 factors that make it kind of good to heed these warnings. Okay. So we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, and say we should never believe preemptive warnings. But as we know, these warnings are not always legitimate. They don't always serve a protective function. Okay. So sometimes, instead of protecting us from misinformation, preemptive warnings serve to protect our beliefs from the truth. And we don't want that. We want to remain open to evidence and shifting our beliefs as we ought to. Okay. And these warnings, problematic preemptive warnings, create barriers to the truth and hamper our understanding. Okay. So 2 examples I've thought about a lot in my own research are conspiracy theories and prejudiced beliefs. So I've thought a lot about the applied epistemology of these. And conspiracy theories, as I noted earlier, rely heavily on preemptive warnings. Okay. So we already said the more evidence that you sometimes give to or show or present a conspiracy theorist, the stronger their beliefs get. The more evidence you give them, the more they think that, oh, the media is just really out there trying to cover up the truth. Or wow, the deep state really just doesn't want us to know what's going on. They're working this hard to cover up the truth. Okay. And similar kinds of reasoning actually show up in prejudice as well. So someone might be told, if they grow up in a prejudiced community, that members of some group may claim to be oppressed, but actually they're just playing the victim card, or they're misinterpreting the evidence, or they just didn't work hard enough, or something like that. And those warnings can make it very hard, difficult for someone raised in that kind of environment to actually receive the evidence they would need to change their minds in the right light. You can give them this evidence and they'll explain it away and say it's not legitimate. It shouldn't be taken seriously. And that allows part of the reason that prejudiced beliefs tend to be highly persistent. Okay. So you might be wondering at this point, what's the true danger of preemptive warnings in these bad cases? And a good first guess is that what's wrong with heeding a preemptive warning in these cases is that it can lead you to believe a falsehood. No one wants to believe falsehoods, so we shouldn't believe the warnings. I think this is a danger. It's not good to have false beliefs, but it's not the true danger. It's not sort of the deepest understanding of the danger we face. So what is the true danger? What I call locked-in syndrome. So that's why I have a little brain locked in a cage over here. Heeding preemptive warnings too often can lead us to get locked into an inflexible and rigid, highly persistent pattern of trust and false beliefs. So it's not just that we come to believe falsehoods or risk coming to believe falsehoods. It's that we put ourselves in a situation where it's almost impossible for us to kind of get out of that state. Okay. So we risk becoming locked in if we heed preemptive warnings when we shouldn't. Okay. So how does this happen? There are a couple things I want to talk about, and this relates to my kind of active research. I'm thinking about these 2 considerations. And there are 2 reasons why heeding preemptive warnings too much can lead to what I call locked-in syndrome there. The first is what I'm calling overfitting. So that's a term that actually comes from statistics. The basic idea is that in statistics, you want to build models of things, a simplified representation of a bit of reality based on data that allows you to kind of understand how some complex phenomenon might really work. But there's always a risk that the model you've constructed might be based on your current data in a way that makes it difficult for you to actually project forward into the future and make correct predictions. You can be overfit to the data in a way that hampers your ability to arrive at the truth. And I think that this happens with trust as well. So in the context of trust, I would say that overfitting can be understood as basically managing our trust in others and in other sources in kind of the wrong way around. So the extent to which we trust someone should be based on the evidence we have that they're trustworthy. But in overfitting, there's a risk that actually our trust is kind of prior to the way that we interpret the evidence about how trustworthy someone is. So instead of proportioning our trust to what our evidence supports, we interpret our evidence in light of a fixed pattern of trust that we don't question. And that's how we get kind of locked in and how we can explain away evidence that we should be taking seriously. Okay. And the interesting thing about overfitting, so understood, is that it can happen to us without really noticing that this is what's going on. So trust is a difficult, kind of messy thing that we do with one another, and it plays out over time. And we have to manage our level of trust in others. And this is just fraught with all sorts of difficulties. And if we're not careful, we can make a decision to trust someone and then make a subsequent decision to trust them and keep making these decisions and slowly over time not realize that we've gotten into a situation where there's very little that could actually shake our trust in that person. So in some sense, we're almost like the frogs in boiling water, except in an epistemological sense. Okay. So overfitting is a real danger. And that's how preemptive warnings can lead us to get kind of locked in to a pattern of trust. Now, turning to the second way that preemptive warnings can result in this locked-in syndrome, as I've called it, we should remember that everyone in our society these days faces those problems related to information complexity that we talked about. So everyone is being hit with this like constant fire hose of information these days, and we all want ways to filter that information, to make sense of it all, to figure out what really matters and what's really true. And as we know, we want to offload cognitive effort. We want to make it easier on our brains to figure out what's going on and what's correct. Okay. So we look for sources that can help us kind of cut through the haze and the confusion. And for this reason, preemptive warnings are highly tempting. They can seem, at least initially, to indicate that someone is a reliable guide to forming our beliefs. And we can be seduced, as it were, by the apparent clarity of their thought. Aha, that's someone who really understands it. They can tell me who to trust and who not to trust. So I'll listen to them. But when we get into this temptation, there's a real risk we're going to fall into an echo chamber, which is a kind of environment where countervailing evidence that counts against your beliefs, has actually, or from which countervailing evidence that counts against your beliefs, has been excluded, okay, and discredited. So in trusting a bit of preemptive testimony, a preemptive warning, there's a real risk that we're going to end up falling into this kind of environment where the information we would need to change our minds is not even going to be presented to us. We're going to have that filtered out before we even receive it. Okay. So in each of the cases we discussed, conspiracy theories, prejudice, the health misinformation that Sarah kind of fell prey to, overfitting and echo chambers conspired to make it the case that the individual was locked into this pattern of trust. And it's very difficult to know what could get them out. Okay. So what might have begun as kind of an understandable, reasonable enough judgment to trust someone has ended up resulting in this kind of epistemological calamity. And these dynamics are very hard to combat. Okay. So I have another question for you before we turn to some good news. And I would like to hear if you have ever found yourself kind of falling prey to this kind of testimony. Have you ever believed preemptive warning? How have you navigated these situations if you've found yourself in them? Sure. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah, I think that's a very tough situation. It's one that I've found myself in as well. I have family members who, disagree vigorously, we could say, with political and moral beliefs that I hold. And it can be very difficult to navigate that. And in many cases, part of the reason why it's been difficult in my own case to navigate this is because the things that I want to say, arguments that I might make, have themselves been preempted in this sense. And it could be that the same thing is happening from my end, and I'm not even aware of it. That's part of the tricky thing, is that when we're doing epistemology, we're thinking about our reasoning, but we're thinking about it from the inside. It's very difficult to understand the shape of your reasoning and why it's working the way it is as you're doing it. You can't sort of step outside your reasoning to reason about it. So there's a real chance that we ourselves could be falling prey to some of these dynamics too. We might be on the other side, maybe in some sense issuing preemptive warnings, or at least doing something relevantly similar. Thanks. Yeah. Anyone else? All right, well, we can turn to our good news. It's not all doom and gloom. So what should we do about this? How can we actually handle these situations? Well, I've got two sets of advice for us. One set of advice concerns what we should do in the moment when we're in a situation where we've received a preemptive warning. The second set of advice will be more long-term considerations that we could have in mind. But we'll start here. We want to be vigilant. I love this word. I think we should be vigilant with our trust. So that's our little brain over there. He's being vigilant. He's on the lookout. And that's what we ought to be doing. So the central insight of this view is what I'm calling dynamic vigilance. It's a way of thinking about trust that strikes a mean between skepticism on the one hand, not believing anything anyone has to say, and blind trust on the other. And the key component to this view is that responsible or appropriate vigilant trust is dynamic in nature. It should move up and down over time as we gather more evidence. Our trust in someone shouldn't stay fixed. We shouldn't say, well, I trust Bill, and because I trust Bill, I'm going to believe everything Bill says and not question or take seriously evidence that might count against Bill's trustworthiness. I think that's a central mistake that we tend to make. So we need to maybe reduce our tendency to interpret our evidence in light of our trust, and instead try to strike more of a middle ground between how we interpret our evidence and how we prioritize trust. Okay. So how do we actually implement this? How do we be vigilant? Well, we can run through kind of a similar checklist to the one we looked at before of conditions that make for a good preemptive warning. We can think about the identity of the speaker. We can think about whether the speaker is an actual expert or a non-expert. We can think about our personal history with the speaker. Do they have a reliable track record? Or is this someone that you know has lied a lot or been mistaken a lot, or regularly says things they're not kind of competent to say? We can think about whether the person's a stranger or a friend. If it's a friend, we might be able to assume they have our best interest in mind in a way we can't when we receive this kind of testimony from a stranger, or someone maybe with a financial incentive to say a certain kind of thing, which can happen on social media. Okay. We also can make sure to remember to think about the specificity of the warning. Okay. So if someone's giving you these sweeping claims, he says, everyone who says otherwise, everyone who disagrees with me is not trustworthy, that's a strike against believing someone. If they say, any source of information from that side of the aisle as unreliable, probably we should actually, I think, be a little bit skeptical there as well. We should be cautious in actually accepting these really sweeping claims. So it doesn't mean we have to completely ignore them, but we should look for specificity, and lack of specificity can be an indication that something's going wrong. It's not necessarily a reason to think someone's trying to manipulate us, but it raises the probability in a way we should take into account. Okay. Third, we should look at the evidence we already have. So I think that this point seems obvious, but it's very hard to do, actually. So when someone gives you a preemptive warning, you should, time permitting, reflect on it. Consider the other things you know about this domain. If a doctor of 20 years tells you not to take a certain supplement that you've heard of on social media, you can look at your history with the doctor and see like, well, I've been going to this doctor for a few years now. I've tended to follow her advice and her advice goes pretty well. That seems like it should factor into my deliberations. Whereas I don't know anything about this person on social media. I also have a lot of evidence that people on social media are pretty unreliable. So you should factor that in instead of just taking this preemptive warning at face value. And that's even in the good case, I suppose. We always want to think about the evidence we have and make use of it, not forget the things we already know. Okay. And finally, we can think about the strength of the speaker's argument. Are they expecting to be kind of taken on faith? Or are they actually giving us considerations that make sense in light of our evidence and our own independent reflections? Okay. So I have another kind of example for us to think about. This involves someone who's actually giving financial information on social media, which is a thing. So I'm surprised by this, but there's this huge industry of people making a ton of money by promoting like crypto scams on social media. I'm not a big crypto guy. I don't quite understand all the details there, but it seems like a lot of people are making a lot of money, half truths at best about crypto online. So suppose that you're interested in making a quick buck and you see a social media video of some guy saying, you know, if you follow my crypto investment strategy, you're going to be a millionaire within 5 years. Okay. And you think, well, that sounds pretty good. I'd like that. Should you actually take that advice? I don't know. But sometimes we'll encounter preemptive warnings that aim to say things like, if you don't take my advice, you're going to miss out. And the banks, you know, these financial players, they're going to say that I'm wrong. I'm trying to mislead you. I'm trying to offer you a get-rich-quick scheme that's doomed to fail. But it's because they don't want you to succeed. They don't want ordinary folks like us to make a buck without getting a cut themselves. So you can start to use these preemptive warnings to kind of lure us in. And you can follow this framework to say like, or to kind of check whether we should actually trust that. Is that warning very specific? We have this kind of vague blanket claim about the entire financial industry. That seems like it needs sort of extraordinary evidence that social media posts typically itself won't be able to provide. So I think running through this checklist can be helpful. But this is not maybe our main point of focus, I think, or it shouldn't be our main point of focus. What we really want to know about is what to do over the long term. So often, thankfully, we won't have to evaluate a preemptive warning in the moment. We'll have some more freedom, time to step back and consider. And what should we do, given that we don't always have to make these decisions in the moment, to make sure that when the time comes, we'll make the right decisions? How do we kind of boost our epistemological immunity to the temptations of false preemptive warnings? Well, one important thing I think we can do, and this touches on your point, is actually to consider diversifying our sources and make sure that we really are reading a variety of sources from all sorts of angles, not just restricted to politics, but in other issues as well, to make sure that we know what people actually believe and what arguments they can give for their beliefs so that we can take a wide range of information into account, okay, and not risk putting all of our eggs in kind of one basket, so to speak, okay. And in addition, we can build good habits of independent fact checking. And this can be quite tough, but with time, we can develop a skill in stepping back and saying, it looks like I actually need to maybe investigate this more carefully before I believe what someone says. So this crypto person online says that the financial industry doesn't want me to get rich without they're getting a cut. And if I invest in crypto, then that will solve my problems. Maybe you should learn a little bit about crypto. Maybe try and think through these issues for yourself before you just assume that the person has your best interest in mind because he's given you this kind of compelling story. Okay. So more generally, whenever there's this kind of us versus them narrative, it's helpful to take a step back and wonder if maybe some psychological dynamics and biases are at play that could be leading us to think a certain way. And building habits of independent fact-checking from reliable sources can help counteract that. Okay. And third thing we can do is to be alert to what I want to call hallmarks of manipulation. Okay. So this would include warnings that are extremely broad, which we've already talked about, kind of unspecific warnings, as well as claims that only one source can be trusted. For many of the issues where people are offering preemptive warnings, the issues themselves are quite complex, and often there will be a reasonable range of opinions to hold on those issues. So take something like school closures during COVID. This was a major source of debate years ago, and it became politically fraught in a way that was ultimately not very helpful. And these days, at least epistemologists tend to think that people on both of the extremes of this issue were overconfident. Probably there was room for more reasonable disagreement somewhere around the midpoint of the spectrum over whether schools should be closed during COVID. And the fact that we weren't able to kind of realize that we were not taking the other side seriously enough and thinking only our side could be trusted was a good reason to think that we were actually getting that kind of wrong. Okay. So if anyone says like only my side can be trusted, we should think that might not be quite right. Let me take a step back and think about this more carefully. And we can also develop what I want to call metacognitive awareness. And this is really important. I think this is something that people aren't necessarily used to doing, thinking about our thinking. It's kind of tough, involves some abstraction, kind of looking down on your thought processes from above. But over time, we can build up these skills and say, or try to ask and answer questions like, have I tended to change my mind much in the past? Or have I tended to be kind of dogmatic? Do I actually consume information from a wide range of sources? Or do I tend to have preferred sources that I never really question? You can start to assess whether you actually tend to evaluate evidence appropriately, or if you tend to be prone to confirmation bias. And we have to start asking these questions of our own thinking. And over time, as we get a better sense of how we manage our own thinking, we can be better at knowing how to respond to a given preemptive warning. Okay. And finally, this gets back to something I believe Elliot said earlier. We should be more comfortable and get used to being uncertain and perhaps suspending judgment about complex issues. Maybe being a little bit less confident in some of our beliefs and being open to changing our minds. Now, that doesn't mean we have to uncritically accept anything we hear. Of course, the whole point of this is to avoid that. It's just that a way of avoiding that might often involve us being too certain, being too committed to a particular line. And I think our brains really dislike uncertainty. It makes them uncomfortable, makes us uncomfortable. It can seem like a threat to our identity to question some of our most dearly held beliefs. But in learning to be okay with uncertainty and learning to think in terms of degrees of belief, that can help us, I think, respond more appropriately to some of the challenges that we face. Okay. So I'm also curious, before we start wrapping up here, whether anyone else has navigated situations like this and done so using any of these tips, or if you have any other tips that you might add to this list. Yeah.
I'm just kind of thinking about the quote, seek to understand rather than to be understood.
Mhm.
And I feel like that's kind of rounds this discussion up in a way. And I think that, like, I don't know, I used to have a lot of certainty on beliefs in my life earlier in time.
Mhm.
My mom would always tell me, like, in this issue, like, you don't know what's right or wrong. Like, there's no objective right in this. So just seek to understand the other side and just see how it makes sense to them. And you can have your own belief.
Yeah, I think trying to make sense of a perspective from the other side can at least be helpful in understanding their reasons. So, our epistemologists might not go so far as to say there's no objective truth, but we could say, our access to that truth is imperfect, and we should acknowledge that and perhaps be a little bit more epistemically humble, we would like to say, and consider that we might be wrong and what it would be like to hold a different view. Yeah. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, I think even just keeping the door open to the possibility that we're wrong and they're right can help quite a bit in navigating informational complexity. And with preemptive warnings in particular, we have to think about the speaker's own access to the truth. Is the speaker willing to say they might be right or wrong? Sorry, that they might be wrong. If the speaker is not willing to be uncertain, then that might count against our taking them very seriously as well. We might think, well, it seems like, unfortunately, you might be the kind of person who just tends to be overconfident. So I'm not really going to buy this preemptive warning. So I think it's good to consider that from both sides too, from our own side, and also maybe start to expect that a little bit more of others and hold each other to that standard to kind of moderate our opinions, or at least be open to the possibility that we could be overconfident. Yeah. Okay. So we should wrap up. And I think that a good way to, this is our brain. We've reached the conclusion, which is great. Okay. So a good way to kind of summarize the point of this talk is that the goal isn't to trust everything. I don't want to say that we should, never accept good preemptive warnings or always reject, always buy into negative preemptive warnings. The point is just to say there is a midpoint that we need to try to strike between skepticism and blind trust. And often we tend to err too far on one or the other of those sides, and we should work a little bit harder to hit the midpoint. So what we need to do is trust wisely with vigilance and good epistemic habits, good habits of cognition and reflection, and especially reflecting on our reflection, meta-reflection. So I think that could be a helpful way for us to go in learning how to more responsibly navigate preemptive warnings. So I think that's what I've got for you. So.
Questions? And the reason I'm holding the microphone in front of you is so the people on Zoom can hear.
I just think it's so funny when I think about the conversation that you had. I can imagine me saying to somebody who believes politically different from me, I can imagine me saying, oh, I really want to hear your side. Tell me about it, which is exactly what I should do. But then I know I don't think it would go very far.
Yeah.
I mean, because, and then again, I think, what makes me think I'm so right?
Yeah.
What makes me think I know everything? Because I'm sure the other person with a different belief feels they know everything.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a great point. And we should, take into account our evidence. If we have evidence to believe that someone really is likely to be mistaken, well, we don't necessarily need to, change our beliefs in response to a disagreement with them. But when we think more about the chance that we're actually right and that we've kind of figured it all out, that might lead us to be a little bit less confident in our own views and at least be open to the possibility that we could be wrong and the other person could be right. And in doing that, we can get a better appreciation of our own beliefs and our own reasons for them. We might be able to think more deeply and critically about the arguments we could give for our beliefs and have a better appreciation of their force. So there are all these benefits that can come along from engaging in these conversations kind of in good faith with the idea that even if it's not likely, there is a chance that the other person could be right. And when we take that seriously, that can lead us to maybe at least appreciate and understand our own beliefs in a better way and be more responsible. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah.
Definition of locked-in syndrome.
Yeah.
So I was kind of a little bit confused if you're referring to it as like a general state of mind that someone's in. So it like relating to multiple beliefs. So in terms of not just stuff that you're pre-warned about, or if you're talking about like you can have locked-in syndrome for this belief and this belief and this belief. Like, are you saying it's more of a general attitude that someone develops or a state of being that they're in per every belief they were pre-warned about?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's going to depend on the case a little bit. So maybe it depends on how much how many preemptive warnings you've received from a particular person and like the domains that they concern. If we're just thinking, that you're interested, especially in like, I don't know, whether to invest in crypto, and you fall prey to some preemptive warnings there. It might be that you develop this kind of locked-in syndrome regarding claims about crypto, but not necessarily other kinds of claims. They haven't been kind of targeted by the preemptive warnings. So there might be just a more narrow range of claims that are targeted there. Now, it could turn out that this takes a different form. You might trust a particular source with respect to whatever they say, rather than a particular domain. So suppose it's, I don't know, suppose you have a friend named Bill, okay, and you really like Bill. You think Bill's a great guy. So you're disposed to trust Bill kind of almost regardless of what Bill says. Surely Bill's going to tell the truth. He's a pretty competent guy, tends to be sincere. You think he's trustworthy. Well, then Bill starts giving you preemptive warnings across different domains. That could get you into a state where you're developing this kind of locked-in syndrome with respect to a wide range of things because your trust in Bill rather than your trust about particular claims. So this could take different forms, if that helps. Yeah.
So, thank you. This is really interesting and helpful. I have two questions. One is whether you think, this has always been a problem in human society.
Yeah.
People manipulating people, people lying, people.
Yeah.
Do you think specifically the rise of social media has created an almost unprecedented example of the problem? Something new has happened in the last 20 years.
Yeah.
And the other question, what do you think this means for a liberal arts education?
Yeah. Okay.
Because I have heard even students say, my parents warned me that you might think like this.
Yeah. They told me, these liberal professors. Yeah. Yeah.
So how do you defend?
Yeah.
What do you think is the most valuable about education as an alternative to this?
Yeah.
What do you do about those who say education itself, if you read this, it's hostile to my value?
Yeah. Yeah, great questions. So I'll start with the social media question. And as a philosopher, I don't want to take a super strong stance on like an empirical claim about whether things are worse now than they were before. But I will give you some intuitions and hunches I have, at least. We'll hedge them appropriately. But I do think that social media has changed things. You're right that preemptive warnings have always been a feature of human society. We've unfortunately always been manipulable and manipulating one another. Social media has given more people a platform than ever before. In the past, it was not easy for one person to be heard by a million people. Now it's pretty common. You can be, a 15-year-old and do some funny dance moves online and all of a sudden have an audience of millions, which is wild. That's unprecedented, I think. And that raises the stakes. More people can offer this kind of testimony, these preemptive warnings, to a larger audience than ever before. And because they prey on these kind of like base instincts we have to avoid complexity and fit in with our groups, it's really dangerous. More people, I would suspect, are susceptible to the influences of this kind of phenomenon now than 30, 40, much less, 100, 200 years ago. Yeah. Regarding education, that's a tough question. So I grew up in a family where I was told those sorts of things. So I have a weird background for someone in academia. I was actually homeschooled because my parents distrusted the education system so much. They pulled me and my sisters out of school because they thought, the purpose of the education system was some kind of indoctrination that they were opposed to. So I received a lot of that kind of testimony. I think I have an interesting perspective on it, having been in some ways on both sides of it now. And when I've encountered that kind of situation, at least with students, I tend to try, at least to acknowledge, there could be something here. I don't want to completely rule out that perspective. I don't want to say that I know that it's false or I'm certain it's false. But the value of an education is that it can allow you to investigate the reasons why people hold the beliefs they do. So we can learn from psychology and history and communications how people acquire the beliefs they do, how they tend to spread. In epistemology, we can learn whether those beliefs are really up to snuff. Are they rational? Are they based on evidence in an appropriate way? And I always encourage my students to put their beliefs to the test. And it could be they're right. I don't want to rule that out. But investigate them seriously using the rigorous tools and methods and concepts that we can provide. And if they stand up to the test and I end up being wrong about the value of education, so be it, but I doubt that will happen. That's kind of my response when I've had those situations arise with students. Yeah. I think it's a wonderful question to be thinking about. Yeah. Yeah.
Question, but I just kind of wanted to add on to your response to the question about social media.
Yeah.
And speaking as someone who was never alive for a world without social media, I have
Yeah.
no experience without it. One thing that I'd say, like, I know most people know about this, but I think is important to think about it, and that wasn't sort of said in the response, is the idea of like how social media and the internet in general affects what sort of echo chambers we find ourselves in. So
Yeah.
I try and think about like a world without social media, what type of echo chambers you find yourself in. And it's about like the people that you live around, like whether all those people around you have homogenous beliefs and the sorts of media that you consume. But the difference between that media and social media is
Mhm.
that you are often like choosing to buy that media. So you pick which newspapers you want to buy, you pick which books you want to
Yeah.
buy. And that sort of stuff isn't really forced on you.
Mhm.
Whereas when it comes to social media, you have the algorithm, which
Yeah.
is designed to cultivate your feed based on what you like. So it's
Mhm.
obviously not really like forced upon you in the fact like you are choosing to watch those videos,
Yeah.
but it is, this echo chamber is no longer crafted solely by what you choose to consume. It's crafted by what is fed to you by the algorithm. So if you watch a video about like crypto for a minute and they see that watch time is up, they'll promote more crypto videos, and oftentimes leading you down this rabbit hole where
Yeah.
it's just misinformation after misinformation.
Mhm.
So I think the idea of this like crafted echo chamber that social media and algorithms like have introduced to the world
Yeah.
is what makes me think, as someone who's grown up in this age of social media and has like not ever been divorced from it, that's what makes me think it's a very unique phenomenon and environment to grow up in.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a very good point. So there's a lot there. The first thing I want to focus on is like idea of algorithmic delivery of content. In some sense, like, someone who owns a newspaper has always wanted the newspaper to appeal to the audience, right? So try and take into account the preferences and values of the audience and deciding what stories to cover and how. But we never had this level of fine-grained detail over people's preferences or regarding people's preferences over a wide range of topics in the way that, Facebook might have, or sorry, Meta now might have this data about us. So there's a kind of precision targeting that's possible these days that might not have been possible from, a TV studio 50 years ago or a newspaper company, 100 years ago. And what this enables, I think we have to consider how that relates to confirmation biases and the other biases we know that we're prone to. And we're, in essence, I take it these days, able to really prey on our tendencies to engage in confirmation bias and seek out novelty. And deliver people, just really precision targeted content that's highly likely to affect them in certain ways, in a way that wasn't possible before. So I think that's a great thing to keep in mind too. A very important difference. Yeah.
I have two questions.
Mhm.
One, so this is all about preemptive warning.
Yeah.
I'm just curious,
Mhm.
what's the difference, or can one study preemptive affirmation, right? Like somebody saying,
Yeah.
make sure you trust so-and-so or whatever.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious about that. And then number
Mhm.
two, does any of this theoretically depend on the intention of the
Yeah.
person giving or creating a preemptive warning? Like you used,
Yeah.
words have come up like, I can't remember, prey.
Yeah.
That
And
implies-
manipulation and
Yeah.
yeah.
So if you could address those questions.
Yeah, great. I'll start with the second question, actually, if that's okay. So the extent to which, so let me know if this is your question. I want to make sure I've understood first. What we're interested in is finding out how we should respond to preemptive warnings and whether we should take them seriously and so on. And your question is, should someone's intentions affect how we respond? Okay. Yeah.
I guess you see my point. Yeah, I'm just wondering, does anything depend on the intention?
Yeah, I think that's good. Probably if we have reason to think that someone is highly likely to manipulate us or they have incentives to say one thing rather than another, we should take that into account. And often we will have that kind of information, even if we don't like it, even if we don't want it to be true. We all know if you're on social media and you're looking at, crypto feeds or alternative health information, there's a real chance that there are some funky incentives afoot, and we need to take that into account. That's not to say that people sharing that information necessarily intend to prey on us or manipulate us, but the effect might be the same. So there's that question. Yeah, so I guess I can give two responses to that then. One, if you have reason to think that someone is actively trying to manipulate you, that seems to count even more in favor of not believing a preemptive warning. But there's also this related issue of whether they're kind of involved in a social structure or dynamic that makes it likely that you will be manipulated, even if no particular individual intends to do it. So that's kind of, I think, an interesting way to think about it. Regarding affirmation, I kind of like this idea. I haven't thought about the positive side of this, telling people, you're going to hear this story, you should definitely believe it. I think that's kind of interesting. On the one hand, I'm inclined to say that might not work. It would be nice if it did, but here's why it might not work. If you already, suppose that for one reason or another you trusted me, I don't know if you should, but suppose that you did, and I told you tomorrow a news story is going to come out that says, blah, 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 and you should definitely believe it. Well, it seems like if I've told you that, maybe you should already believe what the news story is going to say, so that by the time you come to hear the news story, you're like, oh yeah, I already believed that. So in some sense, it might also neutralize the force of that evidence, but in virtue of your already having preemptively taken it into account instead of preemptively writing it off. So I think it's interesting. It's almost more like you're believing me about the evidence, and the actual evidence that's yet to come doesn't make much of a difference. Yeah.
It's not about closing yourself off to anything. Yeah, I was just curious.
Yeah. No, I think it's an interesting case. I need to think more about that. Yeah, there's great stuff there. Thanks.
Other questions?
So I wanted to link this to what people talk about a lot today, which is the crisis of democracy.
Yeah.
And the whole, let's say, democratic systems that emerged in the era after or during the Enlightenment, with the idea that you would have deliberative bodies where people would try to persuade each other by a rational argument.
Yeah.
And that model is precisely what is being destroyed by confirmation bias, so that no amount of countervailing rational evidence can alter the locked in prejudice that the debaters, I probably can't even use that term, but the participants in this public conversation bring to the debate. So the implication of a worsening pattern of locked-in confirmation bias or confirmation suggests that the whole model of modern democratic states is probably at greater risk than it has been before this development, even though there's always been resistance. But could you say more about the implication of this for the survival of democracy?
Yes, nice, easy question there. Yeah. Yes, what are the implications for democracy? Again, I'd want to be, appropriately hedged, and in this case, say I'm not a political scientist, but I'll give you some hunches. And here are my hunches. The implications are bad. That's not to say it's all doom and gloom, but at least part of, I would imagine, what it is for a democracy to really be functional and stable and legitimate is for citizens, those whose voices matter and at least, in the ideal case, determine outcomes, are well informed. The citizens need to be well informed, and part of being well informed involves hashing out your ideas with others, responding to their counter arguments, making your own beliefs more precise, getting a better understanding of your beliefs. And if we're unable to do that because of confirmation bias and various other issues we've talked about, that suggests that the democracy itself probably will be a bit weaker. It might not be as robust as it was before. Now, I want to temper that at the same time, though, and say that although there are probably novel aspects of our situation that we find ourselves in, related to social media and algorithmic delivery of content and so on, at the same time, confirmation bias has been with us from the start. So we've always been prone to confirmation bias. And we've always been prone to various other biases. And, this locked-in syndrome, as I'm calling it. So maybe more people, a greater proportion of the population is now. That's one way that we could think about this. I think it's a tough empirical question that I'm not sure of. A different way we could think is that maybe it's not the case that more people are prone to these issues now. They're just more prone to the issues. So we're all equally, you might think, likely to be susceptible to these issues, but we're now susceptible to a greater degree than we were in the past. So those are two different ways to think about the empirical point about how things might have changed recently, and they might have different implications for democracy. If it turns out that more of us, as a proportion of the population, are now susceptible to these issues, but not very susceptible. We can be rescued, even though more of us need to be rescued. Then the implications might not be that bad. If it turns out that we're all susceptible and our susceptibility has increased, and now not only do we need to be rescued, but the rescue itself is much harder to perform, that would have much more negative implications. So I guess what I would want to do is look into, to the extent possible, whether any given person's susceptibility has increased. And there, I'm not so sure that that's right, but that's where I would want to look. But I think you're right that if the answer is yes, then that spells fairly bad news for democracy, unless we can kind of find a way out of this epistemological crisis, which many epistemologists are thinking about and proposing various reforms to the information environment to kind of at least prevent more people from falling into these kinds of situations. Yeah, thanks.
Could I ask one more question?
Sure.
If there aren't other questions, I don't want to monopolize.
Mhm.
So curious, from your perspective as
Yeah.
a philosopher,
Mhm.
As you say, you're not a political scientist,
Yeah.
you're not a psychologist.
Yeah.
I'm just curious,
Mhm.
how would one go about, are there sort of projects out there? Because this is such, as we've learned, as we all know,
Mhm.
such a vital issue right now.
Yeah.
I'm curious, are you aware of teams of researchers out there
Mhm.
who are drilling into just exactly these questions?
Yeah.
And can you say a little bit about, like, where is that
Mhm.
work appearing and sort of, are there conferences, associations that are focused on these kinds of questions?
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. So I think the answer is that many of us, I think in different disciplines, have been learning that, however you want to frame it, a crisis of democracy, an epistemological crisis, it's multifaceted. There are many reasons why this has occurred, and for that reason, it's helpful to take a interdisciplinary, a multidisciplinary perspective on this. So we need, psychologists talking to political scientists, talking with philosophers, and that is starting to happen, and I think it's really good. So not to, toot my own horn as a member of the Applied Epistemology Project at UNC, but Alex Worsnip, who runs the project, is doing excellent work on this. He's working with a psychologist at UNC and some others in different disciplines to study specifically trust in experts and trying to figure out not just whether we should or shouldn't kind of trust experts, the normative question, like why so many people don't. What's going on? What actually plays a role in determining our trust? How do we apportion our trust? How do we make these trust decisions? And he's trying to get clear on the facts on the ground, these kind of descriptive facts, so that we can think more clearly about the normative facts. So that's one project kind of currently underway here at UNC, which I think is great. And there are a number of other projects in different disciplines and groups collaborating with one another to pursue these kinds of things. In terms of like conferences and stuff that's especially like available to the public, I would need to think a little bit more about that, but I should. Thank you.
That people are on the case.
Yes.
This will be addressed. Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
Other questions for Will? Are there any questions from Zoom? Just checking. Okay,
cool.
All right. I guess then we will adjourn with thanks to Will Connor.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming very much. I appreciated it.